All right. Hi, I am Mary Poplin with Boris FX, and today we're going to talk a little bit about PowerMesh. Can everybody hear me in the chat? I'm hoping so. Um, all right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about PowerMesh, and what we're going to talk about is what do you do when you have occlusions, and what do you do when you have complex motions or mouths opening, eyes opening and closing, and also how to deal with corrections over time, because of course PowerMesh is really sensitive, and sometimes you do need to do corrections. All right, thanks for letting me know that y'all can hear me. All right, now we are going to dive in. Let me go ahead and cut to my screen so you can see here. Let's close some Photoshop here. And let's go over to our desktop and cut. All right, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. So what we're doing is we are going to talk a little bit about how to address this shot. And I am going to talk a little bit about what not to do as well, because that's what I've been doing for a lot of these talks is I've been talking about like, well, what to avoid, right? Because whenever you watch a demo and it's a live canned demo, that we've run through a bunch to make sure that it shows well. One of the things that we've done is we've already pre-selected footage that we know is going to work well, and I want to talk about where things break a little bit. That's the whole point of these office hours, is to give y'all that sort of insight. When we're doing a live stream that can only be about 15 to 20 minutes long, obviously we're going to streamline that as much as possible. Hi, I see everybody in the chat. Very nice. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that thing we do every week, which is talk about where it breaks. So we're going to track this shot, but let's talk about some of the places where you don't necessarily want to do a power mesh shot. Like you think you might want to, but it's really pretty difficult. So this shot, for example, let's talk about this. This shot, normally I would say would be really good for power mesh, even if we did occlusions to the face, except for here's the problem. We're zoomed so far in on her face that we have no other reference areas to track. So because we have no other reference areas to track, because this hand takes up so much space and because the shadow of the hand takes up so much space, I don't know that I would recommend this as a power mesh shot, okay? And the reason is because there's just, at a certain point, there's not much to track. And the power mesh tracker is really sensitive. So we have our planar tracker, right? And our planar tracker is really good about looking through occlusions. Like this sort of stuff doesn't really mess it up because it can track the shadow and it can track through ignoring that motion because that motion is too different than what it's looking for. Power mesh is what we call a subplanar tracker. So it takes our planar tracker and it divides it into a bunch of little planes. And those little planes can be really sensitive. And that's good. You want a sensitive tracker, but it can be bad because, of course, if you don't have enough information to track, then those little sensitive trackers haywire a little bit. And there's different ways to work around that, and I'll talk about that. Jacques asks, can we get the same videos to reproduce your shots that you're doing? He says advice, but yes, the shots that we're doing. And yes, if you go to pexels.com, you can download just about any piece of footage that I have for free. And you can see it right here. This is Pexels Cool Shooters 69777186. And for those of you that haven't been to Pexels, let's go ahead and go to pexels.com. All right, so here's pexels.com. And what this is a whole bunch of free footage and videos and images that you can use. Now, they do have a licensing thing where, obviously you don't want to be showing people in a bad light. But if you type in like cool shooters, let's see if yeah. So here's cool shooters. And what we would do is we would say, hey, let me look at your videos. And under here, you can find their videos. And this is where you can find this video. Okay, so that's where I'm getting a lot of my videos for these tutorials. And the reason that I'm doing that is so that y'all can follow along. If I use free footage that y'all can find, then you're able to follow along. So now, yes, definitely. I agree with you that Pexels is a wonderful website and it really helps. Okay, So another thing to talk about that you really want to avoid when we're talking about Power Mesh, okay, is Power Mesh does not like a lot of reflections. So we've got this can here, and like I would think normally, yeah, I would want to try Power Mesh for this, except for all of these reflections make it not a very good choice for Power Mesh. So I'm going to tell you kind of like what to look out for. So you see all of these shadows coming in. We could try to track this with PowerMesh, but we'd want to make sure that not only did we occlude the hand and the shadows, but we also occluded all of the reflections. And what you'd probably end up doing here is a whole lot of hand corrections. Okay, so that's just something to think about when you're thinking about PowerMesh. Reflections, heavy shadows, heavy lighting changes, and occlusions that cover up the whole object are really not great candidates for PowerMesh. All right, but if you look at something like this, this is a pretty good candidate for PowerMesh. And so why? Okay, well, a couple of reasons. Even though it goes in and out of focus a little bit, we don't care so much about that. Okay, we can handle a little bit of in and out of focus because we're using the Mocha planar trackers. Okay, we do care about this occlusion that's happening to the face, but we can use a regular occlusion to get over that. The difference is you don't see huge shadows passing across her face. You don't see huge lighting shifts happening. You don't see a whole lot of reflections getting put across her face, and you don't see a lot of strong light. And that's going to be what's going to make this a really good candidate for a Power Mesh track. Okay, so let's dive in and let's show you how to track this. So I'm going to do this a couple of different ways. We're actually going to end up putting some face paint on this girl's face. We're going to give a little unicorn face paint on her face. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we track this first. Now, PowerMesh does take a minute to track. So I have actually already done a track that I'm going to come back and show you, but I am going to show you how to set it up so that you don't have to sit through it. All right, so let's launch Mocha. Now, Mocha is going to read from my timeline. It doesn't matter if this is in Premiere. It doesn't matter if this is in Nuke. It doesn't matter if this is in Fusion. It doesn't matter if this is in After Effects. None of those things matter. What matters is that we are using a plugin that reads from the timeline, okay? We want to make sure that our timeline is at full resolution as well. Now, we have a bunch of stuff happening with this shot that we need to be careful of. So the first thing that we want to do, just like we always do in Mocha, is we scroll through and we look about where we want to start tracking and where we want to stop tracking. Now, happily, at the end of this shot, her face is most parallel to camera, largest in frame, least blurry, right? It's in full focus. This is a good place to start tracking. But here in the middle of my shot, you can see I have an occlusion. Well, what do we do with occlusions? If y'all have been watching these, you know that we make garbage mats, okay? And with PowerMesh, you want to make a much bigger garbage mat than you think. When you're doing a PowerMesh shot, do not make a garbage mat that looks like this, where you're coming in to the edges. Uh-oh, it did not like that. Let's, we're running slow here. Let's go to just this. So if you want to do a PowerMesh, don't make a roto shape that looks like this. All right. What you're going to end up with, if you do something like this, not only are you going to have to do a ton of roto to handle these edges, but all of these shadows are not accounted for. Just because I drew an occlusion around the fingers doesn't mean that all of the things that the fingers are casting onto the face are not visible. So let me know if that makes sense to y'all. Let me know if you've had any problems with that in the past where you've done too tight of a roto shape for your occlusion mask and it didn't do anything for you. So we're going to go ahead and make a garbage mask, which is going to be this. And you can see how much looser it is around the object. I'm going to relax these edges, okay? This is one of the reasons I like using X-splines. Now, you can use Beziers, but I wouldn't recommend using Beziers with PowerMesh or anything else. With Beziers, it's just hard to correct the whole shape all at once. Just is not the same. And it doesn't work as well with a planar tracker, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to use the X-splines and relax for a curve. And you see how everything gets nice and smooth, all right? X-splines to me just make more sense. A lot of people like to use Beziers, but when you're in Mocha, I really suggest that you use X-splines. If you take nothing else from this demo, take that from it because the X-splines work a little bit better with our tracking data. Okay. Now, let's track this. So I'm going to select this and we're going to track translation, scale, rotation, and shear, and let's hit track backwards. All right. And we're going to let Mocha try to follow these hands off screen. Now, we're probably going to lose these hands at some point because Mocha's probably going to want to try to track, the features of the face more than it wants to track that blur. No problem. We can just move the shape. And we're just going to have to hand animate that off screen. Now, let's go back to here and hit track forwards. So what we're doing is we're creating a mask that's going to hold out our shadows and our hands while we're doing our PowerMesh track. And that's going to be really important because if we don't do that, we're going to have a real problem. Now, this is 4K footage, so it does take a second to track. All right, let's get that off. Perfect. All right. So now we have to do some hand correction to our roto, okay? And that is no problem. Let's come over here and let's correct our roto shape, just like this. And then we'll just move this off screen to about there, and then off screen entirely. All right, so that's one part of our roto shape. We're going to correct this shape over our fingers right here. And we really want to make sure that we're making absolutely certain that we pull the shadow inside this shape, okay? We want to make sure that we're not leaving stuff on our face here. And the more details that you can pull from the face, the better, but just make sure that when you're creating your occlusion mats, your garbage mat here, that you're getting all of the motion blur and all of the shadows well inside this shape. And that may mean that you do have to do a lot of hand correction, and that's okay. All right, almost. Let's pull this way. There we are. Watching somebody rotoscope is super exciting. All right, again, let's correct this over here. Make sure that we're getting all of those thumbs and shadows. And again, correcting that shape around our blurs. And we're almost done. Gotta pull this off screen here. And then one more will do it. Very good. All right, so that is our holdout mat. Now that holdout mat is really important. And again, it's really huge. Let's make this really, where you can really see what we're doing. We're telling Mocha, while these hands are over the face, ignore this whole piece, okay? And that is gonna matter because we're gonna use the planar track to drive what's happening to the bottom of the face at this point in time, okay? And that's good because we can't see that detail anyway, all right? So we'll call this hand holdout, okay? Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the end of our shot. We're going to turn our tracker off, and we're going to make a large shape around this girl's face. Now, we can do this one of two ways. We can either make a large shape around this girl's face, and we can use the Add to X-spline tool to cut her eyes out, just like this, and to cut her mouth out a little bit, just like this. Now, why are we doing that? We're doing that because we want to have the PowerMesh shape not include her mouth because she opens her mouth in our PowerMesh, and we want to not include the eyes in our PowerMesh. So we can track this way, or we can track this way. What we're doing is we're just going to pull right around our features here, just like this. It really doesn't matter how you do it. It just matters that you're giving PowerMesh enough information to create its mesh and to ignore the parts that would mess up your shape. So for my original shot, I did this. And let's just come in here and let's use a generation of a uniform mesh. So let's click perspective and mesh. And let's say we want a uniform mesh on our face. Now, this is where we're defining those subplanar tracks. Okay, so we have our major planar track that's driving most of the PowerMesh track. And then we have the subplanar track, and that is defined by smoothness down here. Now, obviously, this is way too many sub features to try to track. So let's crank this up to like 200. All right. And let's generate the mesh again. That's probably too many. Let's go down to 150. Generate mesh. We could do 150. We could do 100. And what we'd end up with is a decent mesh size for our PowerMesh track. The higher that number, like the higher number of subplanar tracks that you're making, obviously the more detailed your mesh, the less likely you are to get tearing. But it's a trade-off. Because every time you use more subdivisions, just like anything, whenever you increase the math, okay, you're going to slow down your tracking time. So just be aware that there's certain things you can do to either increase or decrease your tracking time. We want to strike a balance to getting the information that we need, okay, but also being able to track in a reasonable amount of time. All right. Let's delete this shape and let's drag 6 under hand holdout and let's call this face. Okay. Now, what I want you to notice is when we come back here, our shape is held out of our track. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit track backwards. We're going to track translation, scale, rotation, shear, perspective, and mesh. We're going to just leave it on the Mocha defaults because we're tracking so much pixels that we really don't need to up this number. And we're going to leave the smoothness at about 50% because for faces, smoothness is pretty good at 50. But here's the thing about smoothness. At 100% smoothness, okay, that means the PowerMesh is 100% following the planar track, okay? And at 0% smoothness, that means PowerMesh is driving absolutely everything about the track. So think of them as two separate tracks, two separate pieces of math data that are being tracked at the same time. You have your planar track and your subplanar tracks. Smoothness is how much we're relying on either of those things to get the jiggle, the secondary motion in our shot, okay? So water, a good level for water would be 0, okay? A good level for paper would be, you know, closer to 100. So, okay, we have a question, which is it the same when you add more track points in a camera tracker in Nuke if you increase the number of points it needs to track also on 3D Equalizer? The more trackers, the more times it needs to track. Yes, anytime you ask any computer to do more calculations, you are going to take a hit on speed. Mocha's no different. You know, we don't have a magical algorithm that somehow doesn't tax the GPU in the same way. So anytime you are asking the computer to do more, it is going to take more time. All right, so now let's go ahead and hit track backwards. And I kind of want to show you what this is going to do. So this is going to chug backwards for a little bit. And I'm not going to make you sit through this whole track, but I just want to show you what it's doing. So it's looking at all of these subplanar tracks over time, all right? And then it's trying to account for the occlusions in that area, okay? And then it's trying to create a new data set based on what the planar track is doing and these subplanar tracks are doing. So you should start to see scrunching and wiggle in the face. Now, again, I'm not going to make you sit through this whole thing. So let's save this and close it. And let's jump into our pre-tracked file that I've already tracked because I've already baked this cake for you and I don't want you to have to sit through it because at that rate, it'll probably take about 15 or 20 minutes to track. And I don't know that I have it in me to talk through 20 minutes of track. Now, the nice thing is that a lot of solutions that use things like optical flow tend to take even longer than that. So the nice thing about Mocha is you can babysit the track. Like before my office hours, I sat and I kind of babysat the track and looked for where it was going wrong. And so that we could talk a little bit about how to fix it. So in general, most of this track is good, but you can see that there's a little bit around her mouth that isn't, okay? And so we're going to actually have to hand correct that. And that's either a failure of our occlusion or it's a failure of just a shadow that we didn't see or it's just that we're tracking this over time and it just takes time. So let's look at why that could be. And let's talk about how to correct it. So let's stop and let's scrub now that our track is complete. And you see we start to lose it right here. We get this kind of, it's a shadow right here that her hand is casting on her face. I'll zoom in so you can see it. It's real subtle. But the thing is Mocha's a computer, so it does exactly what you tell it to do. You see how that's jumping into shadow there? That's what's making that track jump. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to account for that. And I think until it gets to about right here, we're doing pretty good. So now let's start to edit this mesh. So let's show our track mesh and let's select our track mesh. So to do that, we're going to hit our edit mesh button, okay? And we're going to make sure that we have a lasso selection tool, okay? And now we can start to adjust these points. All right, so I see right here that these points are being troublemakers, okay? So let's just make a quick little keyframe. Excuse me. Let's make a quick little keyframe right here. All right, so moving it because I'm on auto key gives me an auto keyframe. I can also add a plus sign to make a keyframe there, but I like to wiggle it. All right, now let's try to figure out where these go. I feel like they were right here and right here. All right, and so now what we're doing is we're doing a hand correction between our little keyframes here. Now I also see that right here we have a little bit of a problem. So let's go to our other keyframe and let's adjust this just like that. And so now we've still got to account a little bit for how wide that's getting. So let's just pull this over. Do you see how this point was past this point over here? If we want to put something down there, that's going to really be a problem. All right. All right, that's looking better. All right, we also want to adjust here. All right. That is looking better to me. So what you can do is you can eyeball it. And what we're doing is we're looking at the grid as if it were a set of polygons. And I know it's very, very exciting to watch people adjust polygons, but that's what we're doing here. Think of it as an adjust track, because as we adjust polygons, let's just go ahead and play through here. As we adjust polygons, you can see that where we started, it's flat, okay? But as her face bends and moves in space, you can start to see the 3D aspect of those polygons over time. Oh, I see Ross has joined us. That's wonderful. All right. So what we're doing is we're going to want to apply something to this face. So how do we start to take this data that we've adjusted and we've done some adjust tracks on? How do we take this data and how do we add stuff to it? Like how do we, change how it looks on our face? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. So why is there mesh over one eye? Well, if you can see, the mesh shouldn't be tracking a lot over that eye. So if you look here, it created a mesh, but it's not tracking that mesh. It's tracking the data around it. Let's go ahead and show you what I mean by that. That's a good question. So to be clear, someone in chat asked, why is there mesh over that eye if we're not tracking it? Because we're tracking all of this detail around it. We're not actually tracking this eye detail. So if you look at the mesh in that eye, it's just moving along with the planar track. But these mesh points are moving along with the edge. And that's because it's actually a pretty sensitive tracker. And when I made that original shape for the holdout mask, do you remember how big the hand shape was? So part of that is because we're tracking not features, but subplanar areas. We're tracking little planes at a time. It tries to generate those planes around the mask, but because of the feature size, it's not going to be right up to the side of that shape. It's going to be a little bit outside or a little bit inside. This falls a little bit outside. But again, if you look right here, this point isn't really moving. It's the points around it that are moving. So even though we're holding that out, the rest of the mesh around that mesh is waiting on either side of that mesh to move it. Does that make sense? And it's still moving all along with the planar tracker. All right. Now, I hope that made sense. Let me know if that answered your question. And also, I see Ross is in the chat to also answer questions. All right, now, let's say I want to apply something to this face. I can do that. And there's a couple of ways that I can do that. Let's see, it's 1:25, so we're doing good on time. If I want to do something to this face, what I would do is I would use an insert module. So let's turn our mats off here and let's go to our insert clip. Now you can see we can start to use various things to put on our face, including a grid. I don't want to do that though. I actually want to use an insert layer on her face. So we're going to select insert layer and I'm going to set that in my host. Now, yes, so Juan is saying you got it. Mocha just completes the mesh to generate the extra information. So it's the mesh that makes sense. Yes, you're correct. All right, so we're going to save this and we're going to close. Okay, and now back in my host, okay, what I can do is I can define that insert mesh. So we're going to actually just put this face paint onto her face. And I've already cut this out. Okay, I just took an image of face paint and I cut it out so that I could put it onto her face. I'm not going to make you sit through Photoshop for that. Suffice to say, I used the selection tools and I used some blending modes and I pulled this off of her face so that now I can put off of somebody else's face. So now I can put a face paint onto this girl's face. And we're going to do a unicorn because I'm a nerd and I want to. Okay, so that is our face paint. So we're going to select our layer. We're going to go into Mocha Pro and we're going to select our insert layer and it's going to be facepaint.png and it's transparent. So we're not going to worry about that. All right. And we're going to go ahead and launch Mocha. All right. So now that we are launching Mocha, we're going to let Mocha read from our timeline. It's going to load up the PowerMesh. It's going to take a second because it's got a lot of PowerMesh to load. Okay. And we're going to select our face here. And you can see that we've got our, let's turn that off. We're going to turn our grid off right now because we know our grid looks good. We're not going to worry about that. Okay. So now we're going to start worrying about how do we apply this to the face. And let's also go ahead and hide our masks as well. Let's hide our masks and let's just go to splines off as well. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this to her face. Let's turn my surface tool on. All right. And let's go all the way to the end of my shot. And let's just align my surface tool to the size of the comp. Okay. Now that's still not in the right place, but the aspect ratio is about where I wanted it. Okay. And that's again, because we started tracking on that location. So now let's just put this where we want on her face. And I think we want it right here. I want to have this, crinkle with her cheeks. I want to have it crinkle with her nose. And it's still not like perfectly lined up the way I'd like. So what do I do about that? All right, well, now I can actually go into the insert module. And the nice thing about this, let's go into our insert module here. I can use the grid warp tool and I'm going to actually use it on level 2 and show our grid warp. Actually, let's use it on level 3. All right, so now you see I get a whole bunch. Let's turn our surface tool off and let's zoom in. You can see that I have a whole bunch of little crosses now that I can use to sort of puppet tool my face paint around, just like this. All right, and I want this to be more on her nose, more straight. All right, we want these eyebrows to align just like this. And again, we want to curve this in with her face, the same on either side of her face, just like this. Let's scroll up. Let's make her unicorn horn just a little bit more straight, just like that. And let's bring this ear over a little bit. All right, so now I've reshaped how this paint is sitting on her face. And this gives me a lot of control. All right, now the photo I took this from, of course, was not her face. So I have to arrange everything to fit like it belongs in the space. All right, now, because I've done that, and because we've tracked in PowerMesh, this will now move correctly along with her face. And what's really cool is I can start to use blending modes to blend this in. So we could come in here and we could render this with motion blur, and I could say, hey, let's do an overlay, or let's do a multiply to have this on her face. But in this case, we're going to just do a opacity, and let's take the opacity down just a little bit. Let's take it to like 95% so it blends a little bit better with her skin. All right. And so now what we've got here is we've got face paint that blends a little bit better with the scene, okay? Blends a little bit better with her skin details, all right? And now what we can do is we can render this out. So let's save this and let's close it. Now, if you guys remember, we used to apply stuff like this with PowerMesh by doing a stabilized pre-comp. So we'd stabilize the PowerMesh, we'd do whatever we wanted to the face, and then we destabilize the PowerMesh. But recently, we've made it to where PowerMesh works in insert, which means you have all of the cool stuff that's available in the insert module as something you can use PowerMesh with. It really saves you time. If you're an editor, it makes it to where you can do things that previously you couldn't do, because it was really hard to take a PowerMesh, stabilize the whole PowerMesh, and then nest that, and then put effects on that, and then take that nest and then apply the PowerMesh. It just didn't make a lot of sense inside of editing software. Inside of compositing programs, it made a little bit more sense. And it was really meant to help you handle paint and other difficult situations. But we've recently expanded it to be the insert module as well. And you can see that we also added things like the blending mode to the insert module if you haven't used that before. And we changed the way that the grid warp tool works last year as well. And that's been really, really helpful as far as getting PowerMesh to be really powerful. All right. So let's go ahead and save this. And we're going to let it save. And let's close it. All right. And now what I can do is I can say, hey, I need you to render this insert composite right inside of After Effects. And if I've done everything correctly, it will do that. There we go. So now I've got my face paint rendered right inside of my host. And so that is how we can render PowerMesh back to our timeline right inside of After Effects. And of course, I can start to add effects on top of this. I can do some degrain and regrain. I can do some blending with this. I could try to make the lighting match a little bit better on this. And one of the ways I could do that, for example, is I would take this footage and let's duplicate it. And one of the tricks I like to do when I'm trying to match lighting for an object like this is that what we'll do is we'll take this face and we'll desaturate it. Let's do saturation. And you can use the BCC saturation, or you can use the saturation that comes in After Effects. Both are wonderful tools. Obviously, I work for the BCC tool set, so, you know, there's that. So I suggest that, but I also, you know, want to show you that you can use the After Effects version as well. We're going to just do a quick levels on this, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to isolate it. So we're going to duplicate our little insert here. And in our insert, instead of doing the module renders with insert composite, we're going to do insert cutout, okay? And then what I'll do is I will do I want to say an alpha matte. Yes, for my little black and white shadows here, okay? And so now I can take this and I can say, hey, soft light this right over the top, okay? And what that will do is look at what that does to my shading. Do you see how that adds the shadows and lights of her face right back over the top of my face paint? So now it matches my scene. So we're using PowerMesh in two ways here. We're using PowerMesh as an insert, and because we've used it as an insert, it renders with its own alpha because we used a transparent image on her face. And what that really is powerful for is allowing us to then take what Mocha has done and then use that as its own mask. So I don't have to keep rewarping everything over and over and over again. I'm letting Mocha do all the work for me. Pretty cool trick. So that is how we take PowerMesh and we adjust the track. It's also how we use the grid warp tool, which is totally different from the PowerMesh mesh warp, all right, inside of the insert module to render with motion blur back to our timeline. Do y'all have any questions I can answer? I see one right now. So insert cutout is kind of making a matte from the PowerMesh. Yes. So what insert cutout is doing is it's rendering, as long as you used a insert that had its own alpha to begin with, its own transparency, insert will drop that into your scene in things like Nuke, After Effects, and Fusion. Your mileage may vary in pieces of software that don't do mattes very well. So Avid, for example, just you might have to load it as an outside piece of footage. Just keep that in mind because every piece of software handles mattes differently. But for pieces of software that handle mattes and transparency very well, as long as you're using that transparency layer as your insert, you will have transparency for your insert cutout. When you render your cutout, it renders it back to the timeline just as the insert and not as the image behind it. So it's taking that insert, pathing it through the Mocha Pro insert module and rendering it back to your timeline with a new warped alpha. So yes, that's exactly what it's doing. It's making a matte from the PowerMesh and matting its own self out. What you see is what you get when you use the insert module, and that's what I really like about it. Now, obviously, if you are a compositor, you probably want to have as much control as possible. And with the insert module, obviously you're asking Mocha to render it. And so you're stuck with the limitations of what Mocha can render. Now, I don't normally find that to be any kind of a bad thing for my work, but there are people who like to be able to, really get in there and tweak everything. People in Nuke, for example. So in Nuke, I would suggest you use something like an Alembic workflow so that when you export, your PowerMesh out of Mocha, you can export it right into Nuke as an Alembic, or you can export it into Fusion as an Alembic. And then you can start to really get the nitty gritty of, this is my own element with its own alpha moving in like, pseudo 3D space inside of my comp. You have a little bit more control. But for those of us who don't have a need for that, or for those of us who are on a really quick deadline and really want to shave time off what we're doing, I really like the insert module because, again, what you see is what you get, and it renders right back to the timeline. So I hope that explains the various differences of what it is doing. Now we have about 20 more minutes inside of this demo. So we can talk about a couple of things. I can go back and sort of show you the Coke can shot, and we can talk a little bit about how that works. Because for me, the Coke can shot, I kind of want to talk about where that goes totally haywire. And if y'all want to talk about that, we can move to that shot, or we can keep answering questions about this shot. I see that we have another question, which is my recent AE project with the insert logo on a jacket is leaving a black fringe around the logo image with the insert module render. I had to go back and use a corner pin. Oh, okay. So there's a couple of reasons that could be. If you brought your, what does it look like in After Effects? Is there a black fringe around the element when you bring it in from After Effects? Because usually that is a pre-multiplication error that happens when the footage is processed to come into After Effects. So when you go to File, Import, bring your footage in, you can do straight or unmatted and pre-multiplied, and whether or not that pre-multiplication is checked on or off, you can get a black fringy edge around stuff, especially in footage especially in objects that came out of Photoshop, because a lot of times the alpha from Photoshop and the alpha in After Effects don't play nice together. So, okay, if it's not in your shot then, and you're seeing a black fringe around your object inside of Mocha, you can try changing your rendering settings. So inside of preferences, inside of Mocha, there's some render settings, and you can adjust how the insert is rendered, because it could be that you need to change what kind of processing you're using, bicubic or etc. So it was a shape in AE and it's making a black line around it. That's very strange. So that being the case, and not seeing it, I would say that you need to change your rendering settings. But if you're still having trouble with that shot, I might need to put my eyeballs on it to see what's going on with that shot, because just the descriptor in text is not quite telling me where that could be happening. But in general, if that's happening, it's usually because it's a rendering error. So I would check that first. All right. All right. So let's talk a little bit. Let's just play this real quick. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I like the way that looks. Very nice. All right, so now let's save this. We always want to save our projects. Not to put too fine a point on it, I've had users be on our forums be like, I lost 2 days worth of work because Mocha crashed on me. And for me, I'm just horrified that they went 2 days without saving. So make sure you save early, save often, save before you hit render. If you're in Mocha and you want to render something and do a test render, I like to hit save, close, and save my host file because you never know what your video card is going to do that day. So so I tend to save the host as well because that will save whatever you've done in Mocha because the plugin doesn't automatically save, until the host is saved. And then I relaunch Mocha and do any test renders. And that's a really good way to work because, yeah, it's a tiny extra step, but you don't want to have something crash on you, because of the way that computers work. All right. So Edmund is asking, is it possible that you could email me screenshots? Yeah, absolutely. So if y'all have any questions for me personally and you want to see in office hours, these are live and unscripted, okay? And if you have something you want to see on office hours, or if you have something that you want me to look at privately, you can email me at maryp, MARYP, at borisfx.com. That's my email address, and I'm happy to look at stuff. And I'm especially happy to kick footage forwards for next week's office hours, because that way, not only are you learning, but the whole group is learning and we're able to, learn together. So, all right. There we go. All right, so let's go over to our project here and let's find our Coke can. Let's talk a little bit about that. I do want to talk about this for 1 second. This is a real curved surface, and I think we would want to try to use PowerMesh on this to try to get the label on here. But because this is actually a pretty planar motion, you can probably get away with just planar tracking this, and especially because there's not a lot of detail or texture on the label. What I would do is I would track this edge over here where the fingers are, this top edge, this bottom edge, this side edge, okay? And then I would actually use the Mocha Pro Grid Warp to put a logo onto this. So just so you know, that might not be a good PowerMesh shot. It might be one of those things where you want to use a planar track and the Grid Warp tool instead of PowerMesh. So it's good to understand when you want to change those up. All right, so we have this Coke can. All right, and let's say we want to track this Coke can. All right, let's come over to Mocha. And of course, you can also get to Mocha from FX, right? And you can go to Boris FX Mocha. But we're going to type in our effects panel. And now we're going to drag and drop Mocha onto our timeline. All right, so we're going to launch Mocha. Now, I remember saying that this shot is not a good candidate for PowerMesh, and I want to kind of point out why. All right, so you saw earlier how we had tracked the face of that girl, and that was really good. But if we try to track this Coke can, we have a lot of texture that is reflected onto this scene. And what I want you to think about when you think about reflections is, and this is confusing for a lot of users, a lot of times users will think that when they're tracking an object, that's what they're tracking. When you track a reflection, you're not tracking the texture on that object. You're tracking the texture of whatever object is reflected on that object. Okay, so in reality, you think you're tracking a can, you're actually tracking like a curtain across the room. Okay, and that's just normal. That's how the tracker works, because we're looking at a pattern of pixels and how those patterns of pixels move over time. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to do things like paint reflections back into a scene, or when you're doing roto paint work. But for something like PowerMesh, it's a real disaster. So this is not a shot that I would call a really good candidate for PowerMesh, and let's talk about that. Let's just come in here and let's do a quick garbage mat around this hand. And let's track this backwards. We're going to do translation only. Track, 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 track. And there's a reason we're only doing translation. That's because this is a lot of messy roto, and I don't want to have to sit here and mess with it. Juan says, oh man, those reflections. You are correct. All right. We also say, I will be sharing things when I make new ones in the group on Facebook. That would be wonderful. Please do share all of your shots on Facebook so that we can all learn together. All right. So that's my garbage mat. All right. Let's go ahead and make sure that we've got this thumb and all of the shadows inside of that garbage mat. All right. And let's track forwards a little bit as well. And I'm just telling you, this is not going to work. This is going to be like, what you would do is if you were trying to track this shot, is you would get as far as you could with PowerMesh and you do a whole bunch of hand corrections. And that is a lot like not tracking, okay? That's a lot of hand corrections. And that's not really what you want. But we're still going to show you how that looks so that you know when you're doing shots what to avoid. Or when you know that when you're doing shots, some shots are just going to be a lot of hand work and that stinks. In fact, you might even be better off doing like a 3D sort of hand animated offset for that crunch. But let's see. Let's see what we get. I'm not going to track this whole thing because we don't want you to have to sit through it, and also we'll run out of time. All right, so one more thing. When I'm doing this garbage mat, you see that thumb is already reflected on the can and it's not inside the shape. We're going to have to fix that. So we got to pull and get that thumb inside of our shape at all times because that thumb is not a reflection that we want. Same thing for our hand right here. So you can see already we're running out of a lot of stuff to track. It's like, oh, there's not a lot to track here. All right. So that's another reason why this is kind of problematic. Let's come in here. There we are. All right. So now we have that whole hand, all the shadows and the reflections for this can. All right. So now let's start tracking PowerMesh on this. Let's make a little square right around our can. And let's do a uniform generation. We don't want to do automatic. If you look at automatic is looking for a bunch of features it can find again, and that can be really useful. But for this kind of crunch deformation, not going to be super useful. So let's go to uniform, generate our mesh. It's probably too much. Like let's just, for the purposes of tracking in a reasonable amount of time, let's take this down to 40. Okay, and now let's hit track forwards and track backwards with perspective and mesh. All right, I'm going to leave smoothness at 50, and we're going to leave minimum % of pixels used at 50. And let's up. Let's drag this underneath, call this can, and let's call this fingers. All right, so now let's hit track forwards. And what you're going to see is as we track, even though I had to turn the gear off of fingers, I don't want to retrack them. As we're tracking this, what you're going to see is this is going to do its best to try to track that deformation, but because we're tracking reflections, we might not get something that looks exactly how we like. Okay, so this would be one of those times where you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to do a lot of hand corrections to try to get that general motion. Okay, but we're not going to get it perfect. Yeah, what a nightmare. This is actually a nightmare for sure. You're correct. Like one of our comments is what a nightmare. And yeah, I wanted to show you all a shot of like what not to do, because I get a lot of those in the forums. You know, I get like somebody thinking that PowerMesh, for example, is magic, and it is not magic. It is really good at what it does. And what it does is subplanar tracking. All right. But because it does subplanar tracking, we have to think about like, well, what does it look like when we are doing a subplanar track? You know, what is that really doing? And what it's doing is it's following a little bit of texture data in a subplanar way, right? In a divided way, in a bunch of polygons on our major planar track. All right. And because we're doing that, it's subject to a lot of interference. And that interference, like reflections, like shadows, you know, can sometimes read like a texture, and sometimes you can get away with having something look like it deforms correctly. But if you look at this, it's really not going to deform correctly because those reflections are rippling up the can. They're not going in, they're going up. So we're going to track that up motion instead of in, which is where we want. All right, Ross is saying that he just did a test with the insert graphic, with an insert graphic that he created with an AE shape, pre-comped it and fed it into a Mocha insert. There's no fringing. Might want to email or post in the forums. Yes. Also, do you have any effects on that shape? Because they could be causing that fringing as well. All right. So if you look here, you can see that this is crunching. It's totally crunching. Is it crunching accurately? No. Okay. Like, and it's not crunching accurately because what it's doing is it's following that. It's following all of those reflections. So it looks like it's pulsing rather than going in. All right. So this is why this is not something that you want to really try to tackle as as a PowerMesh. All right. But it is something that you might want to tackle as a grid warp. Okay. So if I did a track on this can, for example, like just a planar track. All right. And let's just track this can just like this. We're going to want to cut out this middle section here. So let's do like a little add to X spline. All right, let's cut out as much of that reflection as possible. So now we're tracking the top and bottom of this can. All right, we're going to track translation, rotation, scale, shear, and perspective, and we're going to let that track through. This would be a good candidate for doing some hand corrections. All right, so what you can do is you can let that track. It looks like it's following it along pretty nicely. All right, crunch, crunch, crunch. Yeah, bending nicely, slanting exactly how I want. And you see we're tracking those edges. All right. So now what I can do, we've got 10 minutes left, so I don't want to take too long. But actually, we've got 8 minutes left. So you can see that we have that nice tilt to what is happening to the can. All right. Because we avoided this whole midsection. All right. But we still want that midsection. So what do? Well, what I would do is I would take my surface tool and align it to my can. And basically what you're going to have to do is go into your insert here, turn your grid warp on, and you're basically looking at a whole bunch of hand animations. So, we could come in here and let's take our insert clip and change it to a grid. And let's take the opacity down so I can see what I'm doing. All right, just like this. All right, and now I can see that like I want to start adding keyframes. So let's add a keyframe and let's look at how this is going to crunch in. So what you could try to do is you could try to make this make sense to you based on the track. So now we've got that sort of smash in. Just like that. So that's crunching. And that's starting to crunch a little bit more correctly, right? So what you'd have to do is you'd have to get in here and you'd really have to hand animate this sort of track to get this correct, because you're really not going to get away with running a PowerMesh on this shot. Now, that being said, if you look on our website, we have a crinkled piece of paper that does really well. And that's because it's a crinkled piece of paper. That texture is matte, okay? So if you had to do a shot like this in real life and you are the art director on that scene, or I'm sorry, the visual effects director on that scene, what you'd want is you'd want to either talk to the VFX soup or be the VFX soup and say, hey, we want this as matte as possible. All right. Because if it's matte, then we can get that detail. Okay. We can get that crunch. But if we have something like this, where we've got reflections going everywhere, it is not going to work out and we are not going to be able to replace that information. In reality, though, what's probably going to happen here is somebody would just run a sim on this and do it in actual 3D and replace the can entirely. And this would just be a paint shot. I mean, really and truly. So, but if you were trying to get away with it, doing in-camera stuff needs to be matte, can't be super reflective, and that's why. All right, so now hope that answers that question. All right, now we are going to have to wrap up. I am Mary Poplin with Boris FX. I really appreciate that y'all joined us. If you have any more questions, I'll answer them in the 5 more minutes we have before we have to go. But like and subscribe to these. These are office hours. We do them every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And I'm on here for an hour talking about questions that y'all have asked in the past or that people have asked on the forums or working on your shots that you've sent me. And we do this live. They're completely unscripted. So if I mess up, I mess up, and y'all get to see it, then you get to see me fix it. And that's part of learning together. So this is our attempt to connect with y'all, to give y'all access to us and what we're doing, and to make sure that you are understanding where the software succeeds and where the software needs to be, well, where the shot needs to be planned around what the software can do. And that's really important. Okay, we have to think about, as shooters, as creators, as artists, we have to think about how are we going to shoot smarter? How are we going to make our scene work? Okay, and part of knowing how to do that is knowing how the tools work. So hopefully we're giving you the tools that you need in order to create the best art that you possibly can. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the wonderful compliments in the tracks. That's in the comments. That's really nice. And I hope you have a wonderful day and keep making more cool stuff.